Welcome to another video by Psychology for Life. What I will be discussing in this video is research literacy. Zora Neale Hurston said that research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. Research literacy is the ability to locate, understand, discuss, and evaluate different types of research to communicate accurately about them and to use findings for academic and professional purposes. It is not just one literacy, it is a combination of literacies. This definition is from Budry and Miller in 2016. The first type of literacy within research literacy is information or technological literacy. It is the ability to use resources such as electronic media and databases to locate and retrieve research articles, access resources that are useful in both academic research and evidence-based practice. Based on this diagram, information literacy cycle starts with having a research question in mind. Then you find sources that will help you answer the question. Next, you appraise or evaluate the quality of the sources that you have found. You will then remove the poor quality resources and retain the high quality resources. Then you apply the information you have gleaned from the resources. The final step is evaluating the research product that you have produced. The next type of literacy within research literacy is verbal literacy. This is the ability to understand, discuss, and critique written texts and to communicate about them both in writing and orally. This requires a working knowledge of the vocabulary and conventions of writing and citing research. Numeracy comes next, and this is the ability to understand and apply mathematical calculations and symbols. This requires an understanding of statistics and statistical reasoning, and of how these are best applied to research and practice. Finally, visual literacy is the ability to understand how to read and construct nonverbal texts. This requires a familiarity with how research findings are represented in tables, charts, and other displays of data, and how to use concept maps, graphic organizers, and images to unpack complex ideas and procedures. Which among the different types of literacy are you confident in, and which among them do you need to improve on? It is a good idea to evaluate yourself on each literacy and to develop a systematic plan on how to improve yourself in each of them, because these skills will serve you well even beyond your academic life into your professional life. Since we are discussing research literacy, let us now look at some of the reasons why studies or papers are rejected for publication. These can be used as criteria to guide you into what not to do in research in order to produce a high-quality research. First, the study did not address an important scientific issue. This means that the study may have focused on a trivial topic or a topic that did not have much applicability beyond the research laboratory. Second, the study was not original. Someone else had already done the same or similar study. Right now, there is a bias against replication in journals, and most of them would rather publish originally designed studies than replications. But replication is important in science, so there is a growing trend in publishing replications among journals. Number three, the study did not actually test the author's hypothesis. This means that the variables that were measured or manipulated may have been misidentified, or they were not measured or manipulated well. Fourth, a different study design should have been used. This means that given the research problem and the goals of the study, the type of design that was used was not suitable in answering the research problem and attaining the goals of the study. Fifth, practical difficulties, for example in recruiting participants, led the authors to compromise on the original study protocol. The next common reason is that the sample size was too small. There are rules of thumb as well as scientific ways to compute how many participants are needed in order to have enough power to test the hypothesis of a study adequately. Number 7, the study was uncontrolled or inadequately controlled. This means that there were several confounding variables in the study that were not controlled at all or were inadequately controlled. Therefore, we cannot say whether the results are due to the effects of the independent variables or due to the confounds. Number 8, the statistical analysis was incorrect or inappropriate. There are several specific types of statistical analysis that should be used for specific types of data as well as to answer certain research problems. The researcher should understand the data well and be well versed with the different statistical tests in order to be able to identify the right statistical test to be used for each study. Number 9, the authors have drawn unjustified conclusions. There are times when authors come up with conclusions that have no basis at all from the results of their study. This should be avoided. Number 10, there is a significant conflict of interest. For example, one of the authors or sponsor might benefit financially from the publication of the paper, and insufficient safeguards were seen to be in place to guard against bias. The tendency to come up with biased conclusions is especially strong when we have a stake in the research. For example, drug companies would like to show that drug what they invested really works because they have invested a lot of money in order to create these drugs. Therefore, there must be put in place safeguards to prevent biased conclusions when these drug companies commission researches in order to test their newly created drugs. Number 11, the paper is so badly written that it is incomprehensible. The next slide shows the importance of theory in research. A theory guides the researcher in formulating or posing research questions that will lead to an appropriate research design, which leads to hypotheses that will test the theory, as well as the type of data that should be gathered. The data will confirm or disconfirm the theory. Data that does not support the theory or disconfirms the theory can lead to revised theories or an improved research design. Data that confirms the theory can strengthen the theory and provide more evidence for it. This is what you will call the theory data cycle. The next slide shows a funny representation of what might happen to certain studies along the way to publication. Research is not a clean-cut process, and along the way to publication, many changes can take place and there may be unethical attempts to present it in a more acceptable way than the actual study warrants, just so the study can be published. Of course, this should not be done because manufacturing data or falsifying results is unacceptable and should not be done by researchers. Integrity is the most important quality that a researcher should have. Some people say that experience is more important than research. However, experience is always subjective. The first reason why we should value research findings over our own experience is because our experience does not have a comparison group. We have conclusions based on our limited observations, but we do not have a group to compare it with. Research always asks, compared to what, before coming to any conclusion. Basing conclusions on personal experiences is problematic because daily life doesn't include comparison experiences. Another reason why we should value research findings over our own experiences is because experience is always confounded by our biases. In real-world settings, there are always several possible explanations for an outcome. In research, these confounds are controlled or measured. We should also value research over our intuition because we always have biases that cloud our interpretation of events. Intuition is sometimes right, but almost always wrong. We just tend to remember the instances when our intuition was right and forget the many other times when it was wrong. Again, this is one of our cognitive biases. Part of research literacy is making sense of related literature. Reading the related literature in preparation for creating a research is often a daunting and scary task for many students. Often the reason for this is because they do not know the meaning of key research words. Let us get to know some important terms that we should remember when we are reading literature. Primary studies or empirical studies report research firsthand. The authors are usually the ones who carried out the study. Secondary studies or integrative studies attempt to summarize and draw conclusions from primary studies. We usually have four categories of primary studies. First are laboratory experiments. This is where a manipulation of an independent variable is involved. Animal or human subjects undergo different conditions in artificial or controlled surroundings. Second are clinical trials, which are a form of experiment in which an intervention, either simple, such as a drug, or complex, such as an educational program, is offered to a group of patients or participants who are then followed up to see what happens to them. A clinical trial usually has several phases. The first phase is preclinical. Laboratory studies are conducted for several years in order to provide information on dosing and toxicity levels of new drugs. Phase 1 is the safety phase. This usually lasts for several months. Here, the safety of the drug is evaluated. Information is gathered about how a drug interacts with the human body. Phase 2 is the safety and dosing phase. This usually lasts for several months. Further evaluation on the safety of the drug is carried out. Side effects are monitored. Checks are done to determine which dose works best. Checks for the effectiveness of the drug is done. The final phase is safety and efficacy phase. The duration is several years. In this stage, studies are done to confirm the effectiveness of the drug and to monitor the safety of its usage to see if there are really no side effects of the drug. Another category of primary studies are the surveys in which something is measured in a group of participants. Questionnaire surveys measure people's opinions, attitudes, and self-reported behaviors. Organizational case studies is another category of primary research in which the researcher tells the story which tries to capture the complexity of a change effort, such as an attempt to implement change within the organization. Now let us turn to the categories of secondary studies. The first are overviews, which may be divided into letter A, non-systematic reviews, which summarize primary studies. Letter B are systematic reviews, which summarize primary studies using a rigorous, transparent, and auditable or checkable method. It provides a thorough analysis of the results, strengths, and weaknesses of the collated studies. Meta-analysis are the third type, which integrate the numerical data from many studies. The next type of secondary studies are guidelines, which draw conclusions from primary studies about how clinicians, psychologists, or researchers should be behaving. The next are decision analysis, which use the results of primary studies to generate probability trees to be used by both health professionals and patients in making choices about clinical management. And the next one are economic analysis, which use the results of primary studies to say whether a particular course of action is a good use of resources or not. Now let us familiarize ourselves with some terms used to describe experiments or clinical research studies. Parallel group comparison. Here, each group receives a different treatment, with both groups being entered at the same time. Results are analyzed by comparing groups. Next are paired or matched comparison. Participants receiving different treatments are matched to balance potential confounding variables such as age or sex. Results are analyzed in terms of differences between participant pairs. Next are within participant comparison. Participants are assessed before and after an intervention and results analyzed in terms of within participant changes. Single blind. Participants did not know which treatment they were receiving. Double blind. Neither did the investigators know which treatment the participants were receiving. The next are crossover studies. Here, each participant received both the intervention and control treatments in random order. Often, they are separated by washout period or no treatment period. We also have placebo controlled. Control participants receive placebo inactive pill, which should look and taste the same as the active pill. Placebo or sham operations may also be used in trials of surgery. Factorial design, a study that permits investigation of the effects, both separately and combined, of more than one independent variable on a given outcome. Example is a 2 by 2 factorial design tested with the effects of placebo and aspirin alone, streptokinase alone, or aspirin plus streptokinase in acute heart attack. Let us now look at some broad categories of quantitative research. Most quantitative studies are concerned with one or more of the following. First is therapy, testing the efficacy of drug treatments, surgical procedures, alternative methods of service delivery, or other interventions. Preferred study design is the randomized controlled trial. Second is diagnosis, demonstrating whether a new diagnostic test is valid and reliable. Preferred study design is a cross sectional survey. Third is screening, demonstrating the value of tests which can be applied to large populations and which pick up diseases at a pre symptomatic stage. Preferred study design is a cross sectional survey. Next is prognosis, determining what is likely to happen to someone whose disease is picked up at an early stage. Preferred study design is longitudinal survey. Fifth is causation, determining whether a putative harmful agent, such as environmental pollution, is related to the development of illness. Preferred study design is cohort or case controlled study, depending on how rare the disease is, but case reports may also provide crucial information. Sixth is psychometric studies, measuring attitudes, beliefs, or preferences, often about the nature of illness or its treatment. The next type of study is often considered the gold standard. In a randomized controlled trial, participants in the trial are randomly allocated by a process equivalent to the flip of a coin to either one intervention, such as a drug treatment, or another, such as placebo treatment. Both groups are followed up for a specified time period and analyzed in terms of specific outcomes defined at the outset of the study, for example, death, heart attack, serum cholesterol level, and so on. Because, on average, the groups are identical apart from interventions, any differences in outcome are, in theory, attributable to the intervention. Next are cohort studies. Two or more groups of people are selected on the basis of differences in their exposure to a particular agent, such as a vaccine, a medicine, or an environmental toxin, and followed up to see how many in each group will develop a particular disease or outcome. The follow up period in cohort studies is usually measured in years, since that is how long many diseases, especially cancer, takes to develop. Next are case controlled studies. In a case control study, patients with a particular disease or condition are identified and matched with controls. Patients with some other disease, the general population, neighbors, or relatives. Data are then collected, for example, by searching back through these people's medical records or by asking them to recall their own history on past exposure to a possible causal agent for the disease, generally concerned with the etiology of a disease rather than its treatment. Next are cross sectional surveys. A representative sample of participants are recruited, then interviewed, examined, or otherwise studied to gain specific answers to a specific clinical question. Data are collected at a single point in time but may refer retrospectively to health experiences in the past. Examples are the study of a patient's medical records to see how often their blood pressure has been recorded in the past 5 years. Next is the case report. A case report describes the medical history of a single patient in the form of a story. Case reports are often run together to form case series in which the medical histories of more than one patient with a particular condition are described to illustrate an aspect of the condition, the treatment, or most commonly, adverse reactions to treatment. The next slide shows us the evidence pyramid. Here we see unfiltered information at the bottom and filtered information at the top. The higher you go up the pyramid, the greater the rigor of the studies conducted and the greater the evidence provided. If you look at the bottom of the pyramid, you have here expert opinion, which do not constitute as studies. Here we have opinions from experts who have not really conducted empirical studies. The National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia is the source of the following guidelines for assessing the clinical evidence for interventions. These are also used in the levels of evidence in the evidence pyramid. So, the five components of the body of evidence for studies constitute the following. First, the evidence base in terms of number of studies, level of evidence, and quality of studies, or risk of bias. Second, the consistency of study results. Third, the potential clinical impact of the proposed recommendations. Fourth, the generalizability of the body of evidence to the target population for the guideline. And fifth, the applicability of the body of evidence to the healthcare context. With regard to the first criteria of evidence-based, we have the following components. A is quantity of evidence, or the number of studies, the number of patients or participants involved in the studies. B is level of evidence, based on the evidence pyramid. C, quality of evidence, how well the studies were conducted in order to eliminate bias, including how the subjects were selected, allocated to groups, managed and followed up, and how the study outcomes were measured. Consistency of evidence refers to whether the findings are consistent across the included studies, indicating that the results are replicable. Clinical impact is a measure of the potential benefit from application of the guideline to a population. Generalizability covers how well the subjects and settings of the included studies will match those of the guideline recommendations, specifically the patient participant population being targeted. Finally, the last criteria is applicability. This addresses whether the evidence base is relevant to the national healthcare system or to more local settings for specific recommendation. And there you have it. Thank you for watching until the very end this rather long video on research literacy.